Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and on this month's Grass10 update, I'm joined by Grass10 advisors Nikki Kennedy and John Conroy. John, what's the situation on the west and northwest?
In terms of grazing, Catherine, it's been very difficult. Obviously, we had a couple of walks there along the west, myself were working together there, and I suppose it's been very stop-start. I suppose more stop than start in a lot of farms. I suppose anyone that kind of is well set up to graze, I suppose, been well rewarded this spring and has been doing a good job. But a lot of cases have been very tricky, and I think there's a lot of stock still in sheds at the minute.
And on farms, what's the plan for those paddocks that haven't been grazed yet? Like, we're coming near the end of the first rotation. In a lot of cases, a lot of farmers aren't near that target yet.
Yeah, so in reality, like it's very realistic that a lot of these paddocks or fields won't be grazed at this stage. Like, no, it's a dedicated grazing ground. So, like, really all they can do at the minute is, I suppose, make a start or continue on what they're doing, but just to, I suppose, continually walk their farms and keep an eye on the first grazed paddocks. And, once there's a reasonable cover back on the first few they grazed, basically move on, start the second rotation and kind of remove the surplus as bales or thrown to silage pit or whatever. But it's kind of a case of just walking the farm, because we're coming to April now, and growth has been high, but it's going to accelerate even more, especially if we start applying fertilizer. So it's just a case of walking the farm and keeping an eye on things.
And you mentioned they're getting stock out. Which paddocks should farmers be targeting at this stage to get stock out onto first?
Yeah, I suppose, unfortunately, we're going to repeat some of the things that were said in the last update you done with John and Nikki. But yeah, it is a case of targeting, like, lower cover of paddocks. Like, say we were at a walk there, Catherine, up in Headford there with Brian Audley, and he had a good few of his weigh-ins out, and he was kind of targeting his lower covers. But like, also in doing that, he was able to allocate a larger amount of ground, so he was getting through more ground quicker, but he was doing less damage as well. And cattle were kind of grazing out those paddocks well. So it's kind of your lower to medium height covers, 1 fist, 2 fists of grass. And I suppose that's where you start.
And getting started is the main thing, I think, John. Nikki, can you just comment on what the situation is in the east and south of the country, or are you seeing any difference?
Yeah, how are you, Catherine? I suppose we're mixed as well. Traditionally would be a lot drier in the east than the west, but we did have a really, really tricky time there in February and heading into March. But I suppose I can comment here from Grange. Things were a bit delayed in getting out, but once we've got out, the guys on the ground there are doing a good job at taking opportunities where they can. They've had a few hold-ups, like last week we had an awful amount of rain there at the start of the week, and it sort of turned things on its head a wee bit. But no, where people are getting out, they're making a good job of it. I guess people are having to be really reactive. Conditions aren't staying good for a long time, so just sort of playing it by ear. We're seeing stock here in Grange, maybe where the weather's turned against them, just being moved on, and maybe we're not getting the graze outs that we want, but we're protecting the ground there, and we'll get round to it on the second rotation.
And that's the key thing. For the second rotation, what's the advice for those type of paddocks maybe that weren't fully grazed out, or as John had mentioned earlier, where maybe some damage had been done? What advice have you for farmers in regard to that?
It's really putting an emphasis on making sure we're getting back into those paddocks in good conditions. Now, that's being hopeful that we have a lot of them to pick from, but as we move through the year, we tend to get better conditions. So if they've had a bit of damage in that first rotation, or they're not grazed out properly, in order to save the damage, it's really important to get back to them in good conditions and get a good graze out on them to set ourselves up for the main grazing season.
John, you mentioned there the challenge of weather conditions and ground conditions, and with regard farmers that mightn't get silage ground grazed. What advice have you where ground won't be grazed and is going to be closed up in the next week to 10 days for first cut silage?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's a tricky one now, because I suppose some of these fields were grazed early enough in the back end and kind of left there just the way weather came and that. And like, I was even out in a farm there the other day looking at one, and it wasn't grazed since the 15th of October. And like, there was a grass cover about 1800 back on it, but when I cut and weighed it, like, it was actually very white at the bush as it is. And like, it looked, when you stood at the gate looking in, like, it looked very green and healthy, but when you kind of look down through it, it was starting to decay as it is. So like, if you imagine you left that till the end of May or 20th of May or even into early June in some cases. Like that would be very poor quality silage once you get to that stage. So I think the best case to do with that kind of ground is probably just give it a bit of nitrogen there now, probably somewhere between 40 and 50 units. You could even split that up if you wanted to leave yourself the chance to graze it again. You could go with 30 units now and top it up later on if you don't need it, and cut that off the end of April, early May. Like, because if you want to preserve some sort of quality in that silage, like you'll have to cut it sooner than normal. Like it'd hardly be fit to feed dry cows if it's let go towards the end of May.
So really completing a fodder budget now and assessing what quality silage will be needed on the farm next year and apportion accordingly.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Like I was even actually of interest. I was talking to the lads at FBA there recently, just looking at results from the beef welfare scheme last year. Like, and to be honest, like there's a lot of you're talking over 6,000 samples of silage samples, and like there's a lot of suboptimal stuff being made, even in cases where you're feeding suckler cows only, like they nearly go backwards on it. But like if even if you wanted to maintain some level of quality, like you'd have to whip that off a lot earlier, a couple of weeks earlier than normal, and then concentrate on your second cut for quality.
That's great, John. I suppose given the situation, some ground is grazed, some hasn't been grazed yet. We have had very difficult weather conditions that you've mentioned. Nikki, what 3 tips would you have for farmers to keep in mind for the month ahead?
Yeah, I suppose it's sort of banging the same drum again, but making sure you're actually getting out on farm. Ideally we'd be talking about measuring, but even if you're just getting out on farm so you can see, you can keep in mind how growth is going and making decisions realistically, like will you get things grazed? Will you be able to get silage ground grazed? And we're really looking at the coming week or 10 days before we probably have to walk away from it and go with the John's early cut method. Will we even get through the first rotation before our first graze paddocks are back? Some people that are used to starting grazing earlier, they might have in their head, that regrowths are quite slow, because if they normally start grazing, say a month ago, those regrowths would be slower than today. They'll be coming back ready again. So walking the farm, making sure that you're staying on top of where your current grass situation is, because like we always say, every farm is different, every year is different, so you can't really make decisions if you don't know what's going on. I guess my second thing is fertilizer. Like, we all know that the troubles with fertilizer at the moment, so if you have it in the yard ready to spread, that's great. And if you don't, I'd really recommend, like with difficulties in getting it and getting the products you want, like get onto that straight away, even if it might not be a couple of weeks before you can even attempt to spread it. But having it there is the only way to ensure that when you want to spread it, you are able to. Particularly around, we talked about damage on paddocks that have been grazed. P's and K's are really critical to get back onto those paddocks. They really aid in sort of root recovery and root health. So making sure they're there and they're targeted onto those paddocks that need it.
That's great, Nikki. John, what advice have you for farmers?
Well, first of all, I want to re-emphasise the point that Nikki just made there, but the fertiliser, is fierce important. Anyway, I know it's expensive, but it's fierce important to make sure it's in the air if it's not already. But then, I suppose, get out and spread it at the first chance. And ideally, we'd go with an NPK product, and even not to forget sulphur as well. Like, sulphur is great bang for buck too, especially silage ground as well. I suppose just to go back to the point as well about the walk of the farm, and I suppose keep an eye on the kind of first couple of grazed paddocks like that. That basically, if you keep going around the rotation, you're kind of running around a circle and your kind of grass kind of heady the whole time. So just when it's time to move on to second rotation, do that and leave the ungrazed paddocks behind you. I suppose it's also probably worth mentioning as well about slurry. Like, slurry is one thing that's not scarce this year, and I suppose when fertilizer is expensive, just to remember to prioritize slurry to where it's needed, like silage ground, low index fields, and I suppose if you water slurry in your farm, if you have open tanks, whatever, try and prioritize that for grazing ground and to take your stuff for silage ground. That's basically it.
That's great, John. Thanks very much, Nikki, and thanks very much, John.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.
Join me next Wednesday for your regular Beef Edge podcast. Further information from Grass10 is available on the Teagasc website at www.teagasc.ie. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan and thanks for listening.